Good evening, everyone. My name is Brene Lloyd, and I work with Northwatch. And welcome to the first in our Nuclear Waste Online series for 2025. This is the 13th year we've done this series, 4 webinars in the month of February, all focused around nuclear waste and the nuclear industry, nuclear expansion, which of course is a waste generating activity. So I'm pleased to have with me this evening Bill Noel from Protect Our Waterways, No Nuclear Waste, and Wendy O'Connor from We the Nuclear Free North. And I'll ask each of them to introduce themselves when we get to their presentation. So I am a resident in the territory of Nipissing First Nation in Robinson-Huron Treaty Area. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to live in that territory and work and travel throughout Northwatch's area, which is Northeastern Ontario, Robinson, Huron, Robinson Superior, Anishinaabe-Aski Nation territory, and the unceded Algonquin territories of the Temiskaming Outaouais watershed. And also in the area of Treaty 3, Grand Council Treaty Number 3's treaty in Northwestern Ontario, where we join with our colleagues in the Northwest to form We the Nuclear Free North, where we've done a lot of work and spend a lot of time because of the nuclear waste management organizations incursion and activities in that region. So this evening we want to do a very rapid pace walk through the current state of debate with the nuclear waste management organization's proposal to transport, process, bury, and abandon all of Canada's high-level waste in a single location. We're going to begin with background and context. I know that many have been part of many other previous presentations, but we do still have people joining this conversation all the time. So that'll take a few moments for background and context. Then we're going to hear from Bill and Wendy from the ground, from the territories, from the regions where the NWMO has been carrying out site investigations. Then a rapid fire overview of NWMO corporate, what's happening at that macro organizational level, and then look at the road ahead, what's coming next on this issue. And then we'll move to question and answer and discussion. So rapid fire context setting. So nuclear waste, it's a problem. It's toxic, radioactive. There have been hundreds of millions of bundles of high-level radioactive waste generated through the reactor operation. It goes in as uranium and comes out as highly radioactive nuclear waste, hundreds of different radioactive isotopes, 1 million times more radioactive than the uranium that went in, and it takes 1 million years for it to return to that same level of radioactivity. And companies operating nuclear reactors to produce electricity in Southern Ontario, which is 93% of the waste has been generated in Southern Ontario, the other 7% between ACL activities at Chalk River and in Manitoba, and Lapro and Gentil in Eastern Canada. The majority of it is Southern Ontario. And they've created these massive stockpiles of highly radioactive waste, and now they want to bury it. So the Nuclear Waste Management Organization in 2010, they began studying locations associated with 22 different municipalities. By 2020, they had shortlisted to 2 potential locations: the Rebel site between Ignis and Dryden in Northwestern Ontario, and the Teeswater site in South Bruce in Southwestern Ontario. And on November 28th, they announced that they had selected the Rebel site in Northwestern Ontario as their preferred location. And that site is at the headwaters of the Wabigoon River, 20 kilometers upstream from the Wabigoon Lake Ojibwe Nation. And it's in the very heart of Treaty 3 territory, which is home to 28 First Nations. The Rebel site is distant. It's distant. It is not distant to the people who live in the region, to the 28 Treaty 3 communities, to the communities who live in the surrounding area, or the many, many, many communities along the transportation route. But it is distant to the waste. It's on average 1,700 kilometer trip from the reactors, Pickering, Darlington, Bruce reactors in Southern Ontario, longer, of course, from La Pro or Gentil in New Brunswick or Quebec. And with that transportation distance comes transportation risk. So the NWMO's Adaptive Phase Management Project has 4 operating stages. But prior to operation, there's a siting process, the site selection, the impact assessment, and the early licenses from the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. Adaptive Phase Management has these 4 operating stages: extraction, transportation, processing, and emplacement. And those are the way we've captured those 4 stages, not the way NWMO has captured them. And then, of course, post-operation abandonment, when the NWMO will walk away from that site. So extraction is transferring the radioactive waste into the transportation containers at the reactor station. It's been in dry storage containers, unmonitored. There's no internal monitoring of those dry storage containers. And they will have to be transferred into the transportation packages. All the NWMO has said to date, in any of their public documents, is at each interim storage facility, the waste donor is responsible for the retrieval of the used fuel. Transportation is the next stage. It is laden with risk, both under normal operations, where there will be low levels of radiation emitted from each shipment. That's 2 to 3 trucks a day for 50 years plus. But even those low levels become a greater dose. Exposure is dose, distance, and duration. NWMO's calculations are that this will not cause harm because they assume the trucks will be moving. The trucks will not always be moving. They'll be stopped for rest breaks, for construction, for accidents, for natural extreme weather events. And so they won't always be moving. And in the case of an accident, if there was a breach of that packaging, there would be much larger releases, and so much greater, not just risk, but exposure, which is risk laden. Processing will take place at the selected site, and that means transferring the waste from the transportation container to the final container, to the used fuel container, in what the NWMO euphemistically calls the used fuel packaging plant. This will include exposures to workers, releases, radioactive releases to air, to water. It will generate additional waste, liquid radioactive waste, low-level radioactive waste, and intermediate level radioactive waste. So there will be risks and exposures from many different parts of this operation. And this is still at a conceptual stage in the NWMO's work plan. Emplacement is when they transfer those wastes into the underground chambers. And those underground chambers, where they are actually placing the waste, it will be so highly radioactive that workers cannot be present. That waste will have to be handled robotically. The releases from the underground environment include constant venting to the surface with no filters. The NWMO has a plan to only turn the filters on if there's an exceptionally large release, an accidental release. Otherwise, the air will be simply vented to the surface. There will also be water pumped to surface during operations, which will also be contaminated, and it will go into the same surface ponds as water from the other parts of the operation. And then in the long term, of course, the containers will fail. If there's no unexpected accident or unintended releases during placement, there will be after placement over longer periods of time. Eventually the containers will fail and there will be releases, and they will make their way to the surface and to surface waters. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bill, who is our first speaker for this evening. And Bill is going to give us the update from South Bruce. Bill, if you wouldn't mind beginning with introducing yourself.
All right, thank you, Bernine. I'm Bill Knoll. I've been the vice chair of Protect Our Waterways, No Nuclear Waste out of Teeswater. And I have moved from Teeswater, but the fact is that Teeswater site is in the Saugeen-Ojibwe Nation territory. So without any further ado, I've been involved with this project since 2020. Let me go to the first slide and talk about some of the leadership changes that are going on within Protect Our Waterways. We had 8 directors that started this program back in February 2020, and we decided that maybe we need a break and we need some fresh minds tackling the issues that looking forward. We were able to find 6 very capable directors to take up the challenge, and the new chair will be Charlie Bagnato, and the other directors are Mike Sullivan, Chris Palmer, Rita Groen, Audrey Bross, Tony McQuail, plus myself here. The real reason for continuing on is the fact that, we just don't trust the NWMO, and we have concerns about the council as well. So the team will be watching closely the actions of NWMO and the South Bruce Council. So Bernine asked me to move on to the next slide, which talks about the actual by-election and the referendum in South Bruce. And I thought I'd start with what was the question on the ballot? And the question was really, are you in favor of the municipality of South Bruce to be a willing host for the NWMO proposed deep geological repository? Now, when this was formed, we didn't realize there was another DGR in the making by the NWMO. So we are a little worried about the wording here that could be misconstrued by some people to say, well, you are willing for the high level waste, so what's your problem for the intermediate level waste? During this by-election and prior to it, and really we were looking for a paper ballot approach versus what was used was the online voting mechanism. The real reason behind that was that there's no way to validate the system. So we had requested this paper ballot so that we could actually, do the validation of the results. And of course, the council refused that request. The results were very, very close. Surprised a lot of people that, 1,604 people voted saying yes, and 1526 said no. So it was a very close winning situation for the for being classified as a willing host community. The voter turnout was very well. We had 3,138 people turn out of a possible 4,525 people. And that was important because if the turnout was above 50%, the result would be binding on the council. And that result would be binding for 4 years. That's a municipal law or an act that's within the act. So in that, there was some news releases, and you can move on. And I'm not going to read these directly because you can read them yourselves. But according to the mayor, it was an extremely proud moment for the community to make such a momentous decision through a democratic vote. What I'll say about that is that, for 3 years, we tried to get this council to agree to have a democratic vote, and they resisted every chance. And it wasn't only until late in 2023 that they finally agreed that they would have a referendum. So I'll move on to the next slide. And this is as a result of the NWMO saying goodbye to Teeswater and to South Bruce. The council had a meeting on December 10th, and this is kind of their report. It's a report by the CEO of South Bruce. Forget that slide. You people can read those slides if you want it, but I thought I'd put some comments in about the mayor and how he felt so proud about the whole situation. And he also mentioned that, there were opportunities that they had been investigating, and that, South Bruce looks forward to exploring these opportunities, although I have not heard about what those opportunities are. So on to the next slide, Bernane, please. Oh, wait a minute. Sorry, you'll need to go back one. I skipped it. So the key messages from the CEO was that since 2012, South Bruce received over $25 million. 10 million of that was really to pay for the employees that were hired by the municipality, by the NWMO, and also consultants, what they did the studies, as well as a lot of advertising about the program itself. 15 million was for goodwill, of which 7 million has already been spent. And those projects that 7 million were spent on were good projects, actually. So there was payback here. The final two payments that the South Bruce received was 4 million for the willingness condition and 4 million for when NWMO said goodbye and terminated the program. We are investigating, or South Bruce is investigating, well, what are we going to do with $8 million? And it's in reserve at the moment, and we'll stay there until they figure out what projects are going to be best benefit from that. The CEO had very high praise for all the supporters of the project, including the CLC, our own team, the council, anybody that was a supporter. There was no mention about the opposition team whatsoever. But she also went on to mention that the CLC hosted over 100 meetings and engaged with hundreds of people. And she also said that they will be terminated. There's no need for them anymore. So there's no learning going to go on with the NWMO project. What I would say about that, in those 100 meetings that the CLC held, there was always a representative from NWMO there, and also the presenters. Out of the 100 meetings, they've always had a pro-nuclear or pro-DGR presenter at the location and doing the presenting. There was only one presentation that was in opposition to, even though many were requested, but they only offered one, and that was Dr. Gordon Edwards, who talked about what the issues were associated with the DGR. She went on to say that the municipality has benefited not only financially, but also have learned how to manage large projects, therefore showing the world that they can take on large infrastructure projects and they're open for business. They will, she also went on to say that they're going to have to update their strategic plan. It was written in 2021. And of course, with the change with the NWMO exiting the equation, she's not 5, I said 5 here, but it's really 2 dedicated employees that were employed by the municipality and paid for by the NWMO are going to continue on and work on that update of the strategic plan. So move on to the next slide, Bernane, if you would. The real question in a lot of people's mind is why the rebel site and not South Bruce? I mean, after all, and I think you heard Bernane say about the transportation issue. Well, Teeswater is 30 kilometers from Bruce Power. It's a hour drive at the worst. But anyway, the NWMO, I think, were forced to make a site selection in 2024 by their owners and the government. After all, our government has been pushing the expansion of nuclear reactors, and as a result of that, this question of the waste had to be dealt with. However, South Bruce had done everything to please the NWMO. They had lined up with the 9-step process. They took every opportunity to promote the project, and they just don't know what they did wrong. How could they lose? And it boiled down to the NWMO's explanation for not choosing South Bruce was that the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation son refused to meet the NWMO imposed timeline of 2020, the end of 2024, for making their decision. And I want to talk a little bit about that because both chiefs of Sun, in an interview with Scott Miller of CTV News on May 24th, 2024, both said that the NWMO timeline was not reasonable and it would not be met. So this was already known to the NWMO back in May. And no, after the NWMO made their announcement on November 28th, Sun had a news release on that day with from their environment office with the following statements, and I'm reading these as their statements. And Sun has always engaged with the NWMO in good faith. Unfortunately, the manner in which the NWMO has made its own decision is extremely disappointing. NWMO made commitments, many commitments, to work with us to support our decision-making process in a full, respectful way. But it is clear the NWMO continues to act unilaterally behind closed doors and without regard for our processes and for the good faith partnership. That's their direct comment. So you can see that the NWMO didn't try to inform. I don't think they tried to inform South Bruce, and I don't think they tried to inform Sun about their decision before it was actually made public. My other comment here is that Sun has never said that they were not interested to continue with the NWMO project. That, is not, never has been the case. So let me move on to the next slide, Bernine, please. And so why is Protect Our Waterways still interested in dealing with this particular project? Well, we have ongoing concerns. Some of you may or may not know, but land is a major issue. The NWMO still owns 1,100 acres north of Teeswater. They had options on another 400 acres, but those options run out in January 2025. And there's absolutely, in the hosting agreement, there was no way you were providing any resolution for the land owned by the NWMO. So we don't know what's going to happen with that land. Some people say they're going to sell it, but, no action so far. The other concern we have was with Swami's letter to the South Bruce Council, that same council on December 10th, would praise the council for their leadership, courage, and strong decision-making, and states perhaps we can even work together in the future. So what does that mean? This is after you're telling South Bruce, NWMO telling South Bruce, hey, you missed the boat, you're not in. And, to say that they're going to work in the future, what's that mean? So we're concerned, well, we know there's another DGR in the works, and, is that going to happen? Now, the Willing to Listen group were always very supportive of the NWMO, and they said they were disappointed. But again, they thought maybe there's an opportunity to secure a win for the NWMO in the next generation DGR, and that would be a good consolation prize. My other problem with the DGR itself is that the concept of a DGR is only a theory. And without operating experience to validate those theories, it's not a scientific proven undertaking. And I don't know how you could classify it as a safe undertaking at this point. On to the next slide, please. So I'm going to leave you with some of my personal summaries because I'll be one of those directors in time will turn the table over to our new directors and let them function. I'll be around, but I won't be taking an active part. But, as I thought about this program, 12 years that we've been involved, South Bruce and the NWMO with this project, and it's dragged on. And some of the reasons for that is that the NWMO likes to delay things until they think they have an opportunity to make a win. But that was 12 years of wasted effort by all. And you have to ask yourself, well, during that period, what opportunities were missed by the municipality because of the tremendous focus on getting the gold at the end of the rainbow? And that's really what I believe it was. We often hear as well that, the opposition team caused the division within South Bruce. We were the people that, provided misinformation, whatever. And that's totally false. It's the project that completely divided the community. And until all references regarding that project are removed, this healing of the division will not occur. My next bullet really talks about the NWMO, never reveals all the facts. So, already Bernayne mentioned about the dry storage containers, and they're monsters. They're 70 tons when they're fully loaded, and they carry 384 fuel bundles. But, I thought, well, how are they going to remove these fuel bundles from these DSCs? So I wrote Liz Morton back in September of 2024 and asked her, well, how is that operation going to occur? And I got an answer back 6 weeks later. And to my surprise, the answer was they were going to build a room at each one of these reactor sites. The room were going to have concrete walls so that the humans would be protected, and they would also have hot cells. And they would roll these 70-ton DSR or DSCs into this room, and then have to remove the top, and then place the 384 bundles in two different transportation models. So you just never know with the NWMO what's all the answers. They're always, it doesn't appear anywhere, that statement. This is a very important function. It doesn't appear in any of the conceptual design documents or any of the documents I've ever read of how that operation was going to occur. The other point is that the NWMO always say, well, it's a community-driven event. Well, don't believe that. The 9-step process by the NWMO had one intention in mind only, and that was to secure a willing host community. And, if you look at the results for South Bruce, that just confirms who was really in charge throughout the life of this 12 years in South Bruce. So I have a question for you that are listening. Was the South Bruce Council or any other council and the First Nations people and their supporters only pawns in the game controlled by the NWMO? And I really do believe it was a game and it was a risk, and it was like, winning the lottery if you were lucky. And that's it for me. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks very much, Bill. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Wendy. Wendy, go ahead.
Yes, hello. Good evening. I'm Wendy O'Connor, and I've been a volunteer with We the Nuclear Free North for about the last 5 years since We the Nuclear Free North began. I'm also a member of Environment North and have been for a longer period than that. And I'm just going to see if my screen share will work. And I'm going to present on what's been happening in Northwestern Ontario in 2024.
And it begins.
That's very reassuring. Yes, we'll start with the siting announcement, and then I'll backtrack a little bit. As Bill has referred to in his account of the year's events in South Bruce, the NWMO declared on November 28th that it had completed its site selection process, and it had selected the township of Ignace and Wabigoon Lake Ojibwe Nation as its host communities. On my slide there's a screenshot of the NWMO's online announcement. That I just harvested a day or two ago for this presentation. In it, they clearly refer to the township of Ignace and Wabigoon Lake Ojibwe Nation as willing host communities. That was what they announced. But our question is, did either of those communities actually provide the compelling demonstration of willingness, those are NWMO's words, that the NWMO had long promised Canadians it would require before selecting a site? They always said this. And I'm going to backtrack into 2024 to give some background that shows how they broke that promise to Canadians. As we reported in the spring of last year, the township of Ignace at that time had hired a consultant firm to help craft and deliver a community consultation and harvest data from community members in Ignace. It was residents and property owners who were to be surveyed. The township chose this approach to do a community survey carried out by a consultant team rather than holding a binding referendum as was done in South Bruce at the request of their residents, and that was their council's decision. One of our concerns with the community survey approach was that many in Ignace, and we learned this through conversations with residents, they were very leery, even a bit afraid of sharing their views unless they were sure that they would not reach the wrong ears. Many of these people too were not in favor of the project, so we weren't sure that their input would end up being gathered because of the nature of the survey process. It was a rather complicated one, consisted of several rounds of engagements with the consultants coming to town a few times and entertaining residents at get to know us events, free food at the tavern, bowling nights, and that type of thing. And in the end, the final survey was to be completed online. There was the option to come in person and sit down at the computer with a consultant if you didn't have sufficient computer skills or you didn't have a computer or an internet connection. Some of this is troubling, but the crux of our difficulty with the process in Ignace is this, and this is an even bigger issue than the nature of the survey and how it was conducted. The final question that was asked of residents, and it's on your screen under Make Your Choice, that final question that was asked by the consultants and the question on which council purportedly judged the willingness of residents for Ignace to be a host community was this. Residents and property owners could answer yes, no, or abstain to the township continuing to pursue locating a deep geological repository of used nuclear fuel near Ignace. I'm just going to stop my share for a second before I go to more slides. I think many residents, having heard that the pursuit thus far had brought millions of dollars of revenue into the township, would have thought, well, why not continue in this pursuit? And they would vote yes. I think if I was a resident in that position and thinking those thoughts, I'd think, well, is this the final question? It didn't look like the final question. And actually, I noticed on social media around this time that many in Ignace indicated after that consultation was over in conversations online that they thought there would eventually be another vote on actually hosting the repository itself. And I feel this is a fundamental failing of this survey process. If we're going to view it as an exercise to determine community willingness to host the project, yes, it surveyed something, but it wasn't willingness to host. Another concern some people have is that the township chose to include individuals 16 years old and up in the survey process. And there are many arguments for and against this approach. But keep in mind that these young people have been groomed for years by NWMO educational materials and events in their schools, paid for by the nuclear industry. Our view is that this process failed to produce the NWMO's required compelling demonstration of willingness to be a host community due to the flaws in the consultation in the township of Ignace. The other designated host community, let's pull up my share again. The other designated host community is Wabigoon Lake Ojibwe Nation. And it's important to keep in mind that this community was drawn into the process late in the game compared to Ignace, drawn in by the NWMO rather than initiating the hosting and learn more process voluntarily, as Ignace did years before. Wabigoon Lake Ojibwe Nation, also unlike Ignace, avoided media attention as they went through their deliberations and their community consultation. However, when representatives of the nation did grant a media interview, they conveyed that they understood the gravity of their decision and their responsibility to others outside their community who could be affected by the project. But again, as in the case of Ignace, the NWMO failed to obtain the required compelling demonstration of willingness to host the repository from Wabigoon Lake Ojibwe Nation. We know from the nation's public communications that a vote that was open to Wabigoon Lake Ojibwe Nation members, both on and off reserve, was conducted. We don't know what question was asked, but the result of the vote, as expressed in the nation's press release of November 18th, which I have up on the screen, was that Wabigoon had decided to, quote, progress into a site characterization process for NWMO's proposed deep geological repository in Wabigoon Lake Ojibwe Nation's traditional territory. The decision was not on being a host community. In fact, the media release made this explicit, saying, quote, the yes vote does not signify approval of the project, unquote. Yet days later, on November 28th, the NWMO made its declaration that it had two communities willing to be hosts and that it had selected the Northwest Ontario site between Dryden and Ignace for its repository. And of course, we were disappointed in that decision and a little bit baffled at how they could declare that these were willing host communities given the input. For a brief window around that time, we, the Nuclear Free North, pushed back on this in the media. I'm just going to stop my share for a second. And we wanted to spread awareness that the NWMO had failed to meet its own test, that it would only proceed with a compellingly willing host community or host communities. We were also at pains to show that we and our allied groups and individuals were still in this fight. We are, and we've now moved on to our next steps. And I'll detail a bit about what's been going on in 2024 and both before and after this decision. The NWMO's November decision was disappointing, and if we want to discredit the NWMO, they do give us plenty of fodder. In fact, the industry's well-publicized decision to site the repository in Northwestern Ontario has galvanized opposition in this region. Discussions among We the Nuclear Free North organizers and allies have shown that all the groups are still committed to opposing the transport and burial of nuclear fuel waste in Northwestern Ontario. So a quick rundown of a few events and happenings. Early in 2024, and it was probably mentioned in last year's presentation, a group comprised of volunteers from Nuclear Free Thunder Bay, Environment North, and We the Nuclear Free North made deputations to the City of Thunder Bay's Intergovernmental Affairs Committee early in 2024, and I think late in 2023, without much apparent result. But the matter eventually went before council as a question of whether the City of Thunder Bay should resolve to support the waste being managed at its points of production, rather than transported and buried elsewhere, which would bring it through the city, and that it would convey this position to upper levels of government. Unfortunately, council tied on the final decision, on the final vote, meaning that the resolution was not passed. But as in all these situations, a great deal of helpful publicity and media attention was achieved, and the local group was proud of at least having gotten half of council on side. So we've made some good friends and conveyed lots of information to people who need it. Go back to my share. Getting good at this. Lots of visibility events in 2024 in Northwestern Ontario. The picture on the left there of the singers, that's a rally that was held in front of City Hall in Thunder Bay on the day of one of those votes by council, because there was an initial vote and then a ratification vote. We actually prevailed and won on the initial vote, and it was tied on the ratification vote. That's how close it was. Lots of other events too. There were 2 rallies organized by Indigenous groups held in Thunder Bay's Waverley Park in 2024, one in April and one in October. Chief Rudy Turtle of Grassy Narrows was active in both events, as were many other chiefs and council members from diverse First Nations, along with the nation members. and supporters of the Developing Land Defense Alliance, which is an alliance of many First Nations in northwestern Ontario that supports environmental protection and the rights of Indigenous peoples. On the right there, you can see Darlene Nican and many friends on the peaceful walk against nuclear waste in Treaty 3 territory. Darlene is an elder who helps to organize this and walks in it. This was the 5th yearly walk with the best attendance yet by the media and people from many communities, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. This time the walk ended at the site of the proposed repository, so it was a very meaningful occasion to all who attended, and we did get some good media reporting. 2024 was a year of very comprehensive opposition activities and actions, ranging from numerous letters to editors of regional publications, radio and TV appearances, information tables at events and markets, participation in panels, submissions to governmental committees, etc. And we had many information tables and standalone events as well in communities including Fort Frances, Sioux Narrows, Attacopan, Vermilion Bay, Kenora, Sioux Lookout, Dryden, Wabigoon, Nipigon, Terrace Bay, White River, Wawa, and I've probably forgotten some. But a lot of activity and a lot of energy. Opposition group members and allies attended the nuclear exploration event in Ignace in April. We called it the Nuke Fest. We had an information table, actually 2, Environment North and We the Nuclear Free North and Northwatch, I believe. 3 tables there, in amongst many, many tables. It was a busy event. One of the tables, I'm just going to go back a slide. We had this wall of petitions in the bottom right there. That was about 8 feet high. It certainly doesn't represent all the petitions we've collected, but it was an attention getter. A lot of people stopped and talked to us about the opposition and rationales around opposition. So it started a lot of really good conversations, that wall of petitions. Lost my place. Here we are. Yeah, we had opposition supporters active at the Grand Council Treaty 3 panel discussion on the proposed repository in June. That took place in Kenora. Lawn signs were distributed, signatures collected on petitions, information conveyed. And at many of these events, there were also kids' activities, including games and button making. Environment North got a great turnout to their AGM in April with Dr. Mark Winfield and Laura Tangay as speakers on the nuclear power and waste issues. The photos I've shared show a diversity of engagement on this issue, and also its spontaneity in many cases. Now, opportunities crop up, they just arise, and sometimes we make opportunities to raise awareness and tell the truth about this matter. Off screen, meaning I don't have any pictures of them, members of allied organizations met with provincial and federal politicians and presented deputations to the councils of Attacopan, Conmee Township, Shunia Township, and the municipality of Oliver Paypunge. Conmee Township subsequently passed a resolution opposing the long-distance transportation of nuclear fuel waste, so shout out to Conmee. Speaking of resolutions, a lot of resolutions were passed in 2024. This list that you see on the screen can be viewed on the We the Nuclear Free North website, along with all the previous years, but 2024 is the biggest year yet. These are really vital in demonstrating strong regional opposition, which may have strategic importance if the project proceeds through regulatory and licensing stages in the future. My final topic is the 2 petitions that were completed in 2024. So I turned off my share because aside from the wall of petitions, there's not much graphic on that. There was a federal online petition and a federal paper petition. The federal online petition called on the Government of Canada to require the Nuclear Waste Management Organization to demonstrate that it has the consent of residents and communities, including First Nations and treaty organizations, all along the transportation route and in the region of and downstream of the candidate repository sites before selecting a site. The petition collected over 3,000 signatures in about a 2-month period. The government response to that petition was tabled on June 19 by Minister of Natural Resources and Energy, Jonathan Wilkinson. But disappointingly, he simply offered platitudes. It'll be okay, and didn't address actually the substance of the petition and the concerns that we expressed in it. We, the Nuclear Free North, pressed Wilkinson further by letter, but we never received a response that suggested the minister was really attending to the matter. But despite that, as with all petitions, the publicity around it and the media response were very valuable in raising awareness. The other petition was a paper petition, again to the federal government, and paper petitions always are good conversation starters. As Environment North's nuclear lead, Dodi Legasic, always says, every signature represents a conversation. So there were a lot of conversations had. That petition was circulated from May to October of 2024 by volunteers from We the Nuclear Free North up in the Northwest here, and Protect Our Waterways, No Nuclear Waste in Southern Ontario, and other allied groups. And it called upon the Minister of Natural Resources to immediately direct the NWMO to stop the siting process, and listed many urgent reasons to do so. The petition collected over 1,500 signatures, and we divided these petitions. We had the physical stacks of petitions. We divided them among 3 MPs who were willing to present them in Parliament for us. One was Thunder Bay Rainy River MP Marcus Pawlowski, and he presented a portion of the collected petitions to Parliament in December, as did MP Brian Mass of Windsor West. The third portion is held by Charlie Angus, the MP from Timmins, and James Bay, and he's still sitting on them because he didn't get a chance to present in December because Parliament kind of went wild. So he's expected to present the final portion of the petitions to Parliament when it resumes, and the federal government will then have 45 days to respond. So further news on what happens with that as we have it. And I have one more screen share. And we're on my final slide. And it's about the opposition remaining strong. The resistance continues, as I say there. Opposition in Northwest Ontario does continue. It remains very strong. Events, radio interviews, letters, information sharing, and alliance building all continue. Just a week ago, a grassroots event was organized in downtown Thunder Bay by volunteers and allies. A lot of people from communities northwest of Thunder Bay came down, and the event attracted many people of all ages and backgrounds to share experiences and thoughts around this matter. It was a new kind of event, and we hope for many more. So that's a rundown of the 2024 happenings in Northwestern Ontario. There's no sign of anyone's opposition abating. People are frustrated, they are worried about the project, and the NWMO's siting decision has made it real. And it's brought renewed attention to the many things that are terribly wrong about the nuclear industry's plan.
Great, thank you very much, Wendy. And we've got a very active chat file, and I'm going to encourage people to continue to use the chat to respond to thoughtful dialogue and share information, links, and so on, but to not get distracted by other activities in the chat. So I'm going to give our last presentation, and I'm going to go through this at a pretty rapid pace because we do want to get to discussion and Q&A. But I think it's important that we take a look at NWMO corporate. We've heard great descriptions from Wendy and Bill about on-the-ground activities, but NWMO corporate, including reporting, their technical program, who's who in the NWMO, and very briefly about finances. So I'm going to just run through this. So NWMO posted reports. There was a major overhaul to the NWMO website in 2023 We did talk about this in the series last year. The search functions were reduced to documents and reports section, and site search has been shown repeatedly to not yield results, yield reports which are listed in the report section. We can know a report's in there, use the search function, it doesn't come up. Very frustrating. Technical reports, so that the search function is now divided into separate sections. Technical reports, this year there were 20 technical reports listed, and most of the reports, I'll note the few exceptions, were related to the site investigations in either the Teeswater site or the Revel site. A couple of exceptions, the nuclear fuel waste projections in Canada. This is actually a useful report that provides a summary of nuclear fuel production from the various reactor stations in Canada. And also a technical program for long-term management of Canada's used fuel. This is an annual report, and I would really recommend this. This is recommended reading. It gives more insight into the NWMO, where the NWMO is going technically. Unfortunately, there's always a lag. The reports are published generally around May for the previous year. So the technical reports we're going to see this year posted, that I'm reporting on, posted on the website, won't be in the technical report until next year. So other technical reports, again, mostly around site investigations. A couple of exceptions to that were more macro level technical studies undertaken. And then also a field report of sorts, but a study of mineral resource potential of the Revel site. And this was something that was done in a broad brush way back in step 2 in the initial screening, and this is a more detailed accounting of that. Then there were social reports, corporate reports, including sometimes the NWMO categorization strikes me as odd. So a corporate report is a watching brief on advanced fuel cycles, alternative waste management. This is to some degree, it's a watching brief on reprocessing of nuclear fuel waste. And I would place that in the technical report, and NWMO places it in corporate. And then funding and project costs, and then backgrounders and brochures, those that were updated in the last year. NWMO technical reports, we've been reporting on these in the webinars since 2016. And you note that the number of technical reports in relative to the other reports is fluctuating. But this year, of the 35 reports, 20 of them were technical reports. And there are only, from 2016 until now, there have only been 90 technical reports placed on the NWMO website and categorized as technical reports. The majority of them have been reports for other purposes. NWMO's technical program is supported by technical presentations at national and international conferences. They issued 14 NWMO technical reports, 36 journal reports, and presented 23 technical papers. That's the summary from the annual technical report. Interesting, because they report that in 2023, there were 14 technical papers. And when we flip back to 2023, at that time on the website, as of February 2023, there were 2024, there were only 7 technical reports. Now, the NWMO also does some adjusting, both of dates and potentially of categories. So that might explain that, but it's an interesting contrast, and I think it's an indication of the kind of challenges that users have with the NWMO website in finding the documents they're looking for and having them categorized and posted in a way that's efficient and works for users. So these are some of the projects that are described in the NWMO's technical report. in 2024 of the 2023 activities. And I've noted some joint experimental projects. There are several, most of them international, but there's still ongoing an enhanced sealing project at the White Shell Lab in Manitoba. And then a number of the reports are around proof testing programs and a continued development. And I think when we look at this as a list, it illustrates that the NWMO project is still very much under development and a conceptual stage. This brings us back to that question. The NWMO has said repeatedly that they would only select a site where there was an informed and willing community. Wendy's described how they haven't demonstrated that there's a willing community. They haven't made that compelling demonstration of willingness. But we question how a community can be informed when the NWMO project is still not fully described and it's still, in fact, in development. A couple of examples from the NWMO study area. So this isn't the study sites, this is the areas that the NWMO studied and described in that 2024 report. NWMO, they note that their conceptual design for the used fuel packaging plant was issued in 2021, and the conceptual layout is still under development. The development of the used fuel packaging processes have not been finalized. They say the maturing of the used fuel packaging plant will be developed alongside the maturing packaging technology and the UFC design, indicating that used fuel container, the container that they would transfer from the transportation container into the used fuel container for eventual placement underground, that also is still under development, even though they report having done a number of tests on that used fuel container. So it's curious that that's still a maturing packaging technology at the same time that they're reporting successful pressure tests on that used fuel container. A real tone through the 2023 report and the 2024 technical reports that are listed is that they are very much in preparation and anticipation of the impact assessment and the license to prepare a site exercises. They began that in 2022. We've seen listing there are 250 different requests for proposals posted on Bidding Go. And since approximately 2022, many of them have been geared to this exercise to achieve approval through the impact assessment process and the licensing process. The purpose of this work is to strategically advance the used fuel packaging plant development to align with the needs of the impact assessment. And this is something else that we've noticed as a trend, that the investigations are not for the purpose of finding out if something is effective. The purpose is to demonstrate that it is effective. And those are very different research motivations. Some of those study areas continue. So they do acknowledge the less than ideal geosphere conditions are encountered, they'll develop remedial strategies. And there are a number of places, even in that 2021 concept report, which is the last detailed description, and it wasn't that detailed description we have of the NWMO concept. There are many references that indicate that they do anticipate these less than ideal geosphere conditions, meaning rock formations that don't have those qualities of being tight, impervious, and acting as a barrier that the NWMO often describes. And then the potential introduction of new high-level waste forms like small modular reactors. The NWMO is to begin working on conceptual level studies. This is a bit of a shell game with the NWMO. There's two shell games, one about which waste will go where, and we'll be talking about that more next week in the webinar on the integrated strategy for radioactive waste. But it's also a shell game as to whether or not it's the NWMO is responsible for the small modular reactor waste or whether it's the waste generators. But certainly when you look at all the conceptual work done to date by the NWMO, it all assumes the can-do fuel bundle. And the description, which is still fairly generic and certainly not mature, but the descriptions available to date of the used fuel packaging plant certainly could not accommodate waste from some of the small modular reactor designs that we're seeing come forward, like the BWRX 300 at the Darlington site. So two other significant reports that it's good to have a look at every year is the annual report from the NWMO and the implementation plan. So we'll look first at the implementation plan, and this looks at where the NWMO thinks they're going over the next 5 years. And they think where they're going is they'll transition from site selection to the decision-making process and moving on to site itself. So they've got several categories of activities that they describe: engineering, site assessment, safety. And again, all these are still at a fairly conceptual level and developmental in nature. So continue optimization of the engineered barrier system, and so on. And one of the concerns that we have, which we observed during an environmental assessment, that time it was an environmental assessment, for Ontario Power Generation's failed deep geological repository, failed to bring the project to fruition. That failed DGR beneath the Bruce Nuclear Generating Station is that the proponent and the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission cooperated to punt the tough safety questions, like the long-term safety case, to future stages of assessment and licensing. And so this still very conceptual and continued process of developing the project suggests that we might be heading for more of the same if and when this project actually goes to impact assessment in 2028. Then they're talking about transitioning to the site, preparing for the regulatory decision-making process. I note, prepare with community input the submissions to start the regulatory decision-making process. In the IGNIS hosting agreement, IGNIS will receive those documents, the regulatory applications, 45 days in advance of it being filed, and they have those 45 days and those 45 days only, according to the hosting agreement, to make comments. And if those comments are not, if they identify a comment after that 45-day period, they in fact, on the basis of the agreement, are not to raise it in the regulatory process. So that's the kind of community input that the NWMO seems to have in mind. And then they're talking about partnership with these host communities, of which they have one, IGNIS, 45 kilometers away and in a different watershed, but they have signed a hosting agreement. And then transportation. They continue to work on transportation, develop the potential for a socially acceptable transportation plan through dialogue on the transportation planning framework. So more of that very general preliminary framework kind of approach to very substantive concerns and issues related to this project. So moving to the annual report, finances, the NWMO, as per usual, every year their dollar number goes up. So they're going from 2022, their budget was 136 million, 2023, 146 million. And that is for this period of operating. Based on the Nuclear Fuel Waste Act, which is their governing legislation, the NWMO is to provide a budget in each annual report. The budget forecast for the next fiscal year is to be included in the annual report. And what the NWMO included this year, instead of the detailed budget we've seen in previous years, is they say, for 2024, the Board of Directors has approved a budget envelope of 187 million. And then they do give in fine print the cost sharing percentages. So Ontario Power Generation will pay 93.68% of that. That's the share of the waste that they own. New Brunswick Power 3.66%, Hydro-Quebec 2.07%, and Canadian Nuclear and Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, 0.59%. That's the division of waste ownership. And then they also talk in the same section about possible future reactors, very general statements about the proponents that are developing these reactors fund this work directly, but NWMO is doing the work. So we don't see in the NWMO's financial statements that input of money from those SMR proponents or vendors, if that is in fact taking place. So who's who in the NWMO? And these slides have not changed since last year because these lineups have not changed since last year. So I'm not going to talk about them as individuals. I'm just going to identify the different groupings of NWMO players. So there's the NWMO Executive Committee, which is the senior staff in the NWMO. Lori Swamy is the Chief Executive Officer, a couple of technical people in vice president positions, and Lise Morton is Vice President of Site Selection, who many would know from her visits to our regions. Then there's the NWMO Board of Directors. Again, Lori Swamy is on the Board of Directors. And then there's the NWMO Advisory Council. And this is a group that has been in place throughout all these years, and they do have a report included in each annual report. Their job is to provide advice to the NWMO on things like their mode of operation with respect to public engagement, their site selection process, and so on. And they might be a group that it's worth having a conversation with. Then there's the members of the Council of Elders and Youth. And I know a number of these individuals, and they should not be assumed to be supporters of the NWMO project on the basis of their being on this Councilor of Elders and Youth, although certainly at least one of them is. And then the NWMO has these other groups that they don't describe in detail. They have a municipal forum, an environmental review group, geoscientific review group. Those groups do post reports. They do have annual reports, and they are available. The site selection review group, we've not been able to find any reports from that group. Same with community-based transportation working group. Same with the peer reviews. So the NWMO boasts of transparency and openness. A fundamental of transparency would be if you're going to describe that you have a number of working groups within the organization, their work would be reported upon and those reports would be available. Not the case. So the road ahead, where do we go from here? And where is the NWMO going from here? We've heard a little bit about that through the implementation plan. In the NWMO 2023 report, we've seen this graphic over and over again, but they outline the coming years. So they say 2024, the single preferred site is identified. They did it November 28th. And then they outline 2025, they begin preparing. 2028, the impact assessment, 2040 to 2045, beginning operations. And those operations will go through to the end of the century. In their preliminary transportation plan in 2021, they had the last movement of waste from a reactor station pegged at 2088. But there are a number of factors that support a statement that says that transportation will go on for longer than that, and I think we can expect it to go to the end of the century. 2 to 3 trucks a day, at least 50 years, and I think we can say to the end of the century plus. So this is the NWMO schedule. Impact assessment studies are submitted. 2030, the impact assessment is approved, very confident of them. 2030, the license to prepare the site is granted. Again, that kind of confidence. 2031, the license to construct is submitted. And 2033, the license to construct is granted. Very confident. What's left from here is the underground site characterization happens under the license to construct. And then the application for a license to operate, which is when the long-term safety questions have to be grappled with. even if the NWMO and CNSC staff manage to punt them off into future, by the application for license to operate, those long-term safety questions have to be addressed. And then they say 2040 to 2045, operations begin and transportation begins. And then there's the license to decommission and the license to abandon, which are licensing stages under the NWMO licensing process. So what is an integrated assessment? These are pages from the Impact Assessment Agency. An integrated assessment means it's an assessment that is joint between what they call the life cycle regulators. That's the Canadian Energy Regulator, formerly the National Energy Board, and the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. So these will in effect be joint assessments between the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission and the Impact Assessment Agency. And the impact assessment process has 5 stages. The first planning, early planning, very short, 180 days, except as we're seeing now in the impact assessment underway for the Bruce C project, the proponent can suspend time. That 180 days can be extended at the request of the proponent, not at the request of the public, or not to meet the needs of the federal regulators or the Impact Assessment Agency. Then there's a 3-year period to develop the impact statement, and then the impact assessment under a year, and then a decision, a maximum of 90 days, and then post-decision. So this is the very tightened time frame under the Impact Assessment Act. Interestingly, there is already a registry open for the Deep Geological Repository on the Impact Assessment Agency's website. This is the first time I've ever seen a registry open prior to the filing of an initial project description, and it was open to post a protocol among the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, and the Nuclear Waste Management Organization. So they are already getting their ducks in a row in terms of how this assessment is going to be rolled out. So that's the way the NWMO thinks it's going to go. They're not the only they're not the only actors in this play. So as we've heard, Wabigoon Lake Ojibwe Nation had decided that they would allow the NWMO to move to site characterization, which is the next step in the site selection process. They also said, as Wendy noted, that that decision did not constitute support for the project. On November 28th, the day the NWMO announced the site selection, the Wabigoon Lake Ojibwe Nation released a statement saying that they acknowledged the NWMO site selection decision. So they're acknowledging it. They're not condemning it, not condoning it, they're acknowledging it. And they announced at that same time that the project will be the subject to determination from Wabigoon Lake Ojibwe Nation's sovereign regulatory decision-making process, the Wabigoon Lake Ojibwe Nation Regulatory Assessment and Approval Process, their RAP. So it is that process that, through that process, Wabigoon Lake Ojibwe Nation will make a determination as to whether or not the project will move forward. At the same time, Wabigoon Lake Ojibwe Nation is not the only First Nation with land uses in that area. Many of the other 27 other First Nations in Treaty 3 also have traditional and contemporary land uses in the Rebel site area. And Eagle Lake First Nation, which until the 1930s was actually a single community with Wabigoon Lake Ojibwe Nation, they have now launched a court challenge of the NWMO site selection. This was filed on December 18th, and it is asking for judicial review of the NWMO site selection. And their contention is that the NWMO failed to properly recognize Eagle Lake First Nation as a host community for the site, which would mean they have the right to approve or reject the site for the deep geological repository. So the decisions as they characterize it. So there's a lot at play. Already there's one legal challenge, and already we know that Wabigoon Lake Ojibwe Nation is intending to carry their own process forward. So we, the Nuclear Free North, is continuing with some assessment of this decision, some review of the messages that were important in the early stage. They're still the same messages. There is no willing host. We are all at risk, and by we are all at risk, that means people in the area, people along the transportation route, and people who are downstream. NWMO uses bait and switch. This is a new message because the NWMO uses a bit of a shell game over the years, but this bait and switch of saying for a decade and a half that they would only proceed with an informed and willing community, and now they only need a community that's willing to move to site characterization. Fundamental change in the siting criteria. And NWMO has a free hand. It lacks rules, regulation, government oversight. It's not over. Criticism and opposition must continue. It will continue, and it is continuing. And any potential approval is years away. So the basic asks, what do we need in this situation? We need accountability, oversight from the federal government, revisions of the Nuclear Fuel Waste Act to make the NWMO operate by a clear set of rules. Transparency, make the NWMO subject to access to information, require the NWMO to disclose contractual and financial commitments. And I would say also, make the NWMO through that access to information, don't make us go through access to information to access the technical reports that the NWMO describes themselves as having produced. And fairness, make the regulatory process open and equitable, no backroom deals, off the record negotiations, and we need a timeline that accommodates the public and Indigenous engagement. So 7 things you can do: show your opposition, sign petitions, share your concern and opposition, pass a resolution through your church, your neighborhood organization, organize a meeting, meet with your MP and MPP, join or hold public event and solidarity actions, and the rebellion continues. The rebel site rebellion, the rebellion continues and resistance is fertile. And with that, we're going to go to questions and answers. So I'm going to ask that you limit your questions to questions, not comments. You keep your questions short to the point. If you've got more than one, please enter them separately, and keep your questions respectful and on topic. And there's an option to upvote, and you can send additional questions to Northwatch if we don't get to all of them. And I don't know if we will get to all of them because we've got a lot. So I'm going to close the chat so I can't see that anymore. And I'm going to open the question and answer. And I'm going to thank you for your patience as we took up more time than expected in presentations. But this session every year tends to be a little bit dense because there is so much material to cover between NWMO corporate and the siting regions. So I'm going to go to the first question. And it's a question from Neil Alexander, Canadian Nuclear Society Communications Officer, who many of you have met in the chat. NWMO said they will not transport inclement weather. So why show a picture of a circumstance that will never happen? Well, Neil, show me on the record where NWMO has said they won't transport inclement weather, and I'll be very interested. Why would anyone want nuclear waste in their backyard? I'm going to toss that one to Wendy.
You know, that's a question that that I am asked most often by people who have newly learned about this issue, and the more they learn about it, the more their jaw drops. And they say, why would anybody want this? My comment is just, I feel you. I don't know why anybody would want it. I understand, you know, the basic economics and the temptation of the money involved. I think that turns a lot of heads. If you subtract that, nobody would ever want this.
Great, thanks, Wendy. Next question from Dodie to Bill. Given that 54% of all the fuel bundles are coming out of, oh, she said South Bruce, I think she means Bruce Nuclear Generating Station. And given that the transportation will be intermodal, could be intermodal, what is being done to mitigate the risk to the public of a transport collision, the risk covered in the transfers of superloads, and realizing that there will be 14 superloads on each train? Note that each superload is called a dry storage container, a DSC, each holds 384 fuel bundles. So I think I'm going to put that to you, Bill, to ask in South Bruce, now that South Bruce has not been selected as a DGR site and you join the ranks of being a transportation community, is that a discussion in POW now around those transportation risks and how to respond to them?
Not yet, but that's one of the reasons why we continue with POW. We don't believe that this is a good project for any community. Just to be clear, I don't support the DGR as a scientific invention. I think it's just the wrong way to go. And so there is many issues, and you're right. Trying to move those DSCs from even Bruce Power or anywhere else and load them on trucks, those are huge. I don't even know how you could do that because, they weigh 70 tons. And I think a lot of road restrictions are 35 tons. So how are they doing that? That just doesn't make sense.
Great. Thanks, Bill. Next question, I think that's to me. When the opening presenter said NWMO will abandon the site, what does that mean? Are they walking away from the site as soon as they drop their long-term waste? Is there no monitoring or oversight or research for years to come? What's the source of that abandonment? Well, I've already described the licensing stages, and abandonment is the last licensing stage under the CNSC's licensing process. I think at this point, I think the current estimate is that statement is that they'll monitor for 70 years. The 2005 report, which recommended adaptive phase management, said that there would be a 300-year monitoring period. So I think that's a very fluid commitment on the part of the NWMO. There will be monitoring. There is no monitoring method after the waste is in place in the deep underground. So that's the source of the abandonment description. And I'll leave it at that. We'll go on to the next question. The opening presenter said NWMO would not filter air unless something would happen. Is there a threshold for radiation that has to be monitored? So they will be monitoring radiation levels underground. They did not state, this comes from the 2021 concept report, they did not state what that threshold was. It was one of the industry terms like upset condition. That wasn't it, but it indicated that there would be basically the equivalent of a large release if you go to the 2021 concept report, or send me an email and I'll get you that detail. But that is the source of that statement. Someone is confused by the South Bruce presentation. Are you saying the process, Bill, over to you? Are you saying the process was not authentic? Or are you saying NWMO put too much weight in some lack of decision making? I'm just confused. I think we have a guess as to where this question came from. Bill, over to you.
Yeah. Well, we're not confused. The NWMO never did present enough information for our community to be informed. And, the result of the by-election, again, as Wendy mentioned, 51.1% or 51.2% is hardly a compelling. We're not confused. We don't like this project, never have liked it. And we're going to continue our fight against it.
Great. Thanks, Bill. And I don't think the question was asking if you were confused. I think the questioner was stating that he is confused, which might be the case. Next question to Wendy for the IGNACE presenter, for the presenter from Northwestern Ontario. Wendy, was there collaboration between IGNACE and NWMO on the question? I assume that's the question for the online poll for the residents of IGNACE. Wendy, over to you.
Yeah, I'll assume that's the question that the attendee is referring to. I have no proof that there was collaboration or that there was not collaboration. I don't have that kind of insight into the process. I can only say that the nature of the question, my understanding is the nature of the question was up to the municipality, possibly with the advice from the consultant firm.
Great. Thanks, Wendy. I've just lost the question. Will Northwatch and other opposition groups physically blockade transport of people, goods, and waste? That's a very general and generic question. We'll have to see what the future brings. Certainly Northwatch has been part of past efforts, for example, the Adams Mine campaign to stop Toronto garbage coming to an unorganized township in northeastern Ontario, where there was a willing host community that was distant from that township and accepting money. Some similarities, but it remains to be seen. I don't imagine we're going to get to a point where we would have to consider blockading the transport of nuclear waste, because I don't expect we're going to get to a point where the NWMO will be actually moving that waste. Another anonymous question for the IGNACE presenter. Are you saying the NWMO conflated the concept of willing hosts with the concept of willingness to continue to explore the possibility of a site? Wendy.
Interesting question, and the answer is no. I'm not saying that the NWMO conflated anything. My comments are based on our view, looking into the community consultation processes and the results of those processes. And we don't see in the processes that took place in both communities that members of either community made the NWMO's required compelling demonstration of willingness to be host communities. And so that's what I was commenting on.
There's a question during transport. What is the level of radiation exposure? How much gamma radiation? There is a radioactive roads presentation from 2022, I believe, where we do have those details. I will not quote those details this evening because I don't have them at hand, but it's very low levels of radiation during normal transportation. The issue is those low levels of radiation, of radioactivity coming from the containers. NWMO's calculation of safety was based on a number of assumptions: distance from the container, period of movement of the container, and so on. And what we see along the transportation route is many occasions where the trucks don't keep moving. Set aside the need for rest breaks and maybe overnight stays, even on a 1,700 kilometer trip. The roads in between the reactor stations in Southern Ontario and the Revel site are frequently closed due to construction, accidents, extreme weather events, and so on. So at that, as I said in the presentation, dose, distance, and duration is what adds up to calculate the level of exposure, and that will change depending on circumstances encountered along the route. A question: if Finland designed and constructed a long-term waste facility, including transport, why can't Canada do the same? Finland has not designed and constructed a long-term waste facility for use. They do have a construction license. They have constructed the underground, the beginnings of the underground structures. They don't have an operating license, and their review has been extended again for another year. And as I said, when we were discussing the stages, the safety questions, where they need to be dealt with is in the operating license, the license to operate, the license to construct in Finland, as potentially in Canada, may not deal with those long-term safety questions. And that's where Finland is at in their process right now, as the regulator is requiring additional information from Posiva, the proponent, and their review process is ongoing and has now exceeded the expected timeline twice. So for packaging for transport, NWMO will need to meet federal Canadian nuclear safety standards or Transport Canada requirements. Yes, they will have to make those requirements. They will have to have their container certified. The current used fuel transportation package is certified. It's the transportation package that was designed by Ontario Hydro in the 1980s. It went through very limited testing at the Chalk River site in the 1980s, partially completed, partially successful for only the drop and puncture tests and only for half-scale models. For the other two International Atomic Energy Agency safety tests that we have been told repeatedly are the starting point for transportation safety. Those can be substituted with a computer modeling or a calculation. And we know in Canada, the used fuel transportation package has been certified on that basis without full-scale testing for either drop, puncture, fire, or water. So yeah, there are some rules in place and they're fairly flexible. In fact, that used fuel transportation package is now going through a licensing review for adaptation to bring mixed fuel waste from Whiteshell in Manitoba to Chalk River. And again, there's no public access, no public window through many requests to the CNSC and the Nuclear Waste Management Organization. We did finally receive a heavily redacted version of the safety assessment report, so heavily redacted that it couldn't be, it wasn't useful to the technical experts that we had lined up to do a review. So a question from Mary, is the used fuel packaging plant being developed by Aecon? And is Pierre Tremblay, who is the current president of the CNSC, still actively connected with Aecon? Questioning the bias in favor of licensing for the various stages of the project. So I don't know if the used fuel packaging, I can't tell you off the top, Mary, who are the consultants that did the used fuel packaging plant development work that we saw back in 2021. I don't believe it was Aecon, but it could have been. Pierre Tremblay did move directly from Aecon, one of the largest nuclear services companies in Canada, to the presidency of the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. We don't know, I do not think that he is still actively connected with Aecon, although certainly there are personal relationships there, some of which were acknowledged during the last CNSC hearing by some of the presenters. Next question. The end of the presentation, the slide about timelines, indicate the NWMO will monitor the site for decades to come after decades of use. This site does not appear to be abandoned. Why is this Northwatch misleading the audience? So I think I've already answered this question, so I'll only repeat very briefly. The last licensing stage is abandonment. The waste are hazardous for hundreds of thousands of years. As I said earlier, it takes 1 million years for the waste to return to the level of radioactivity, even of uranium. So that is why we say very firmly that the waste will be abandoned while the waste hazard continues. A question from Ol. Lots of vice presidents. The Canadian Nuclear Laboratories VPs get around 600,000 annual salaries. Do we know how much Lori Swamy and her colleagues make? No, we don't. That's grouped. There is a line in the financial statement for salaries, and I think remittances might be included in that, but no, we don't know how much any of those senior executives are making. And another question is Northwatch's position, I'll answer this one, that site selection is de facto willing host community. Is it Northwatch's position that willing host community is irreversible and disconnected from site information and decision-making? So it is not Northwatch's position that site selection is willing host community. In fact, the NWMO has selected a site where there has not been a compelling demonstration of willingness on the part of the host communities, because NWMO has also identified Wabigoon Lake Ojibwe Nation as a host community. So I think that's quite clear. Is it our position that the willing host community is irreversible? There's an interesting question about that related to the hosting agreement signed by Ignace. There is no exit ramp for the community. There is an exit ramp for the NWMO. So on the face of it, that hosting agreement between Ignace and NWMO locks Ignace into perpetuity. Future councils can't change the decision. There won't be another community decision made. So in that sense, it may appear to be irreversible, but the question is, what's the worth, what's the value, what's the weight of that agreement as a contract? That's an interesting question that we're looking for some legal advice on now. And I won't speculate on what the answer would be, but that would certainly make the willing host agreement reversible if that contract doesn't really bear legal weight. The designation of willing host community as far as Ignace certainly appears to be disconnected from the future regulatory decision-making processes, since the hosting agreement obligates Ignace to participate in those regulatory processes, and furthermore to express support for the project in those regulatory processes. A question from Ken. Is there any indication that New Brunswick will not transport to Ontario and keep any new SMR waste at the Point Lepreau site? There's no indication in that New Brunswick Power, to the best of my knowledge, and Ken, you might know better, has been silent on the question of alternative means of managing the waste when and should the NWMO project not come to fruition, and the new SMR waste, which is not part of any of the concept design of the NWMO present to date. Certainly, we would advocate that continued on-site storage is the best option for the waste already existing at Point Lepreau. But we would also advocate that adding waste to that inventory is not in the best interest, in the public interest or the environmental interest. Question from Steve. Is the day around the west wet or dry? When waste is removed from the nuclear reactor, it is air cooled, is radioactively hot, so it will produce heat for thousands of years, must be passed on to host rock. Looking for dry site, dry clay insulates, wet clay will conduct, but also exposed repository to groundwater movements powered by heat convection. This is a contradiction. How will the properties of clay change in the presence of heat and water? That's an excellent question, Steve. There is a report, an aging report 2010, Rock Solid, that talks about some of those unknowns and uncertainties around how the bentonite will react to heat and radiation. The NWMO's design requires that clay to saturate, to become wet, so that it swells and fills the space. That's how it acts as a buffer. But there's questions about whether, in light of the heat and in light of the heat being generated and the other activities in that underground environment, whether the bentonite clay will actually get wet and stay wet and be able to act as that barrier as the NWMO describes. So this might be a question from Roger. There's a question of Wabigoon Lake Ojibwe Nation band members this week to address the amount of NWMO money each band member will receive from the WLON. Yes vote. Will this dollar amount ever be released to the electric rate payers, taxpayers of Canada? That is beyond the scope of our knowledge of the workings within Wabigoon Lake Ojibwe Nation. That's a matter within the nation, and we don't know whether they'll disclose their financial arrangements with the NWMO or their internal financial arrangements. That's to date, we have not seen that information. Question from Stephanie. So what of your level of radiation exposure during transport, given the factors you mentioned? Stephanie, I think I've answered this already. Those will be low levels of exposure during normal transport conditions. Renee, what is the difference in the method of transportation of the waste and the waste for a Moltex small modular reactor? There has been no presentation from NWMO, from Ontario Power Generation, or from GE Hitachi, the vendor for, oh no, sorry, you're talking about the Moltex SMR, for that, from that proponent on the means of waste containment or methods of transportation for the Moltex SMR. So NWMO to date says that they'll use the useful transportation package for CANDU waste from Ontario Power Generation's reactors, and they'll use a not yet developed basket container for non-OPG waste, also for CANDU reactors. There has been no information provided from any party that we're aware of to date around transportation for SMR waste. And NWMO says they won't ship in inclement weather. I think we had this question already. I'm told that if and when an accident occurs along the route, that your house insurance will not cover nuclear waste accidents. Is this true? Yeah, there's a kind of a complicated insurance regime under the Nuclear Liability Act, and your household insurer is not the source for that coverage. If universities have a code of ethics not to bribe, gift, or pay for any research, could the NWMO be cited to be unethical since the site selection paid out to willing hosts to sway their willingness? Wendy, over to you.
Yeah, I'd like to answer that one. Of course, the NWMO is not a university, so legal conditions for universities wouldn't apply, but I understand the nature of the question, and a lot of people ask about this. You know, they sense that the distribution of money and financial inducements by the NWMO are to persuade municipalities, populations that that taking this nuclear waste would be a good idea. And I agree with people that, to my mind, that is unethical, that that is socially wrong for them to do. But the law, which is meant to reflect society's mores, society's values, always lags behind a little bit. And I don't think the law was expecting the NWMO to come along. So currently, as far as I know, their processes of distributing monies are not against the law, but that doesn't mean that they're not unethical.
Thanks, Wendy. And we have what I think is a final question from Ray. NWMO anonymous attendee says they won't ship in inclement weather, but doesn't lake effect happen suddenly? NWMO says they are considering trains, yet another derailment happened in northwestern Ontario today. Will the project be considered irreversible when train was not mentioned until now. Actually, Ray, they do have in their preliminary transportation plan from 2021, they do introduce train transportation as a possible means, and that's what Dodie was asking about earlier, the dry storage containers, which could be in multimodal, and that is to utilize the sending it by train as an option. In terms of weather, we have found nowhere on the record that NWMO says they won't ship in inclement weather. They have said they'll only be shipping 9 months equivalent. That they haven't said that means they won't ship in the 3 months of winter. First of all, we get more than 3 months of winter. It means that they will ship, 75% of the days throughout the year will be shipping days. And so, right, the lake effect can happen suddenly, but in a 17-hour trip, many weather systems can change. So I think that those weather events are quite likely to happen, whether they look at their forecast before they leave in the morning or not. A question from also, that wasn't our last question. Is the annual assessment to OPG, New Brunswick Power, Hydro-Quebec, and ACL to pay NWMO tied strictly to waste volume? Or is there some other adjustment to the fact that ACL's waste is more variable and potentially more expensive to manage? That's a good question for us to explore, all. To the extent that I've seen it documented, it's only by percentage. So that's an excellent question to explore, and I'll undertake to follow up on that. And we've got more questions. We're going to take these last 2 questions, and then we're going to move to our final set of slides. Has the canisters that will hold the high-level waste ever been tested? I think I answered this earlier, but I'll just summarize. So the canisters, the transportation containers, in the 1980s, a half-scale model was subject to 2 of the 4 tests, and they weren't fully successful and weren't fully completed based on the documentation that we were able to review, which came from access to information requests. And we only received 800 of the 3,000 pages identified as relevant to our request. But based on that documentation, they were only partially successful. The other containers, the final container, it has been subject so far to a pressure test at a lab in Edmonton carried out by the NWMO. The other transportation containers have not yet been tested because they're still under development or being designed. And our last question, the NWMO has continued to say that we use electricity here in Northwestern Ontario from down east nuclear plants. I'm going to pass that one to Wendy, and that's going to be our final question. Then we have just a couple of last final slides. Wendy, over to you.
Oh, I got the final question. Yes, that's one we've been contending with, and the NWMO's advertisements have implied to people in Northwestern Ontario that we depend on nuclear power here. That is false. Northwestern Ontario does not depend on nuclear generated power. We have a net surplus of power here, mostly generated by hydro plants and some other sources. So that, combined with the line losses, basically the line resistances between the sources of nuclear power in Southern Ontario and the great distance of the lines up from here, means that we don't use any appreciable amount of nuclear power in Northwestern Ontario, and we don't depend on it.
Great. Thanks very much, Wendy. And thank you all for your participation this evening. And this is, as I said, the first of a series of 4. Next week, we're Nuclear Waste Unleashed. the Nuclear Waste Management Organization's integrated strategy for radioactive waste. You heard Bill refer a couple of times to another deep geological repository. And we'll talk about that next week when we talk about NWMO's integrated strategy and what we have come to call DGR3, a deep geological repository for intermediate waste plus. Then the following week, an international update. That one is going to be at noon Eastern, 11 Central, because we have international guests from Europe, the UK, Scandinavia. So to respect their very different time slot, we'll be having that session at noon. And then our last session for the year, for February, is Big Nuclear Expansionism in Canada. And we're looking at the Bruce C project, Ontario's recent announcement of a up to 10,000 megawatt generating station for Wesleyville, the rash of small modular reactors, and the refurbishment at Pickering, and more. So that's the last session. So I want to thank you all again, and you have on the screen our websites for both Northwatch's Nuclear Waste Information Project, Nuclear Free North, and Protect Our Waterways. So thank you all very much, and good night.